Assalamu alaikum, guys.
Did the UK authorities cover up the trafficking of three British schoolgirls who joined the notorious Daesh terror group back in 2015?
Okay, so now I'm joined with Shamima Begum's solicitor, Tasnime Akunjee. Jazakallah khair for joining us.
What's up? How are you?
And of course, you guys may be familiar with the case that he handled of Tommy Robinson. Pretty much brought him to his knees, took him through the courts, and humbled Tommy Robinson. So, alhamdulillah, we're fortunate to have yourself here with us today. Okay, so the first question I think we all want to know about this is, in terms of the insight that you can give us, what have we missed in this case so far?
Well, I mean, Shamima Begum's matter has been going on since February 2015, so that's over some 7 years, and a lot's gone on, to be fair, in that period of time. What's come out in a book by Richard Carbage is that the Canadian security services were involved in the trafficking of Shamima themselves across the border from Turkey into Syria, and that was a Canadian security service agent called Mohammed Al-Rashid. I don't know if the viewers have missed this or not, but this was known back in March 2015, and we specifically wrote a letter to Sajid Javed, who was Home Secretary at the time, outlining the fact that she'd been trafficked by a Canadian security service agent. What's different now, as of the last couple of days, is that the Canadians, it appears, had admitted that they'd done this, and they'd admitted it to the UK police, namely Mr. Richard Walton, who was head of the investigation into the three girls at the time. And what is quite shocking is that it appears that the Canadians begged the UK and the Turkish authorities to cover up their role in her trafficking. At least on the UK side, that appears to have been the case. The police did not mention anything around this to us or the families of the three girls, despite the fact that we'd written to them and asked specifically about this, and they'd rather disingenuously written back to us in April 2015 to say that they had no updates. And now we know that that's simply not the case. That's untrue.
Okay, so that's actually quite significant. So the highlight over here, what would you say is the key point over here?
The key point is that we have, at a time when the UK government was spending treasure and time in Libya, a failed state, trying to get one of the co-conspirators of the Area Underground bombing back to the UK. This is a person who murdered a large number of people in a bombing, certainly a very dangerous person. The British government was out there desperately trying to bring him to the UK, so they faced a trial and went to prison, which is what he did. He had over 20 convictions for murder. But at exactly the same moment, the British government stopping Shamima Begum from coming back into the UK or facing any sort of trial. And it appears that they were happy to try and cover up the fact that Shamima Begum, a child, had been trafficked by one of the Western security services agencies. And they were covering that up. And it appears that there may be more reason why a cover-up was taking place in Shamima's case, and why she was treated very differently from Abedi, the co-conspirator in the Area Grande bombing.
Okay, so we're familiar, definitely living here in the UK. We've had this case being dragged through the media, radio, television, and there has been a general consensus that Shamima Begum should not be allowed back into this country. But now, with the Canadian Secret Service being involved, do you think it's a simple open and shut case now? Is it as simple as that?
Well, nothing's ever made simple by the UK government. These are strong arguments that will be deployed in November in the SIAC court hearing, where we are appealing the decision by Sajid Javed to strip her of citizenship. And the fact is that had the Canadian security services not been involved in actively taking her across the border, but for their involvement, would we have had her home? Or would even the other number of British citizens who he trafficked, would they even be in Syria either? And at the time, we were very surprised in February 2015 as to how quickly Shamima and the others managed to get off a plane in Istanbul and into Syria so quickly. Our experience had been that where individuals are beating that path there, they had often taken a week to 2 weeks stuck in Turkey before they could cross over the border. So the efficiency of the girls, 3 girls crossing that border, was frankly shocking to us. We thought we had time for the Turkish authorities to track them and to block their travel. Now, that type of efficiency is no longer surprising when you've got a Western state who are part of that trafficking process. So it wasn't just criminals, smugglers, and it wasn't just a terrorist organization, a ragtag bunch of people operating some sort of cobbled together operation to take these children into their war zone and into ultimately many of their deaths. It was the national agency of a spy agency of a very mature Western government that was doing that. And they were doing that whilst they're supposed to be allies of Britain. And they were doing that whilst they were supposed to be protecting the lives of the citizens of these Western countries. But they were doing the exact opposite.
Okay, so a lot of people might be watching and might be saying, you know what, she went to join ISIS. Like, that's a mistake that she made. We should just wash our hands on that and move on. That, I mean, clearly is a very regressive way of thinking, because each case, obviously, I'm sure you can explain better, sets a precedent, even in law, even in our kind of society. So that leads me on to the next question, which is, what does the fate of this case mean for us, and why is it important for you, and why do you feel it's important for you to take on?
Well, it's important for a fundamental reason. You send your children to school, you hope that they're safe. But in this case, there were 4 girls from Bethnal Green Academy, which is a school in inner city London, which had a large number of girls who were radicalized there, 4 of which went off to Syria, only 1 of which now survives. And I think there were 7 others who were made wards of court to stop them from going over. It's the worst case of radicalization in the Western Hemisphere. And it now transpires that was partly achieved by a Western government's involvement in that. Now, why is that important for everybody? Well, it's important for everybody because you send your children to school, you hope that your government or another ally government isn't manipulating your child's mind and then assisting in trafficking them to their death. I mean, I don't understand what's any more important than that, to know that sort of safety of your children. But it's entirely hypocritical where people say, oh, these 15-year-old girls knew what they're doing. We have Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, who were grooming girls of this age and younger for many years and trafficking them. Now, trafficking is not kidnapping. That's not grabbing a child off a street, putting them in a van. It's convincing them to willingly do at that young age what they want you to do, which is to become the victim of child sexual exploitation. So the victims of Ghislaine Maxwell, the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and the alleged victim of Prince Andrew, well, they're afforded the status of victimhood. In Prince Andrew's case, he settled out of court for multi-millions of pounds for a 17-year-old girl, more mature than Shamima Begum at the time. But when it comes to a brown Muslim girl who's been manipulated by the state itself or a Western government itself, well, then they're victims, and we have to wash our hands of them. Entirely hypocritical.
Yeah, 100%. That definitely does set a worrying trend. So, I mean, as somebody that's representing the case of Shamima Begum, where do you see this case going, given the previous trajectory of this country and the whole counter-terrorism initiative?
Well, we've had this case go from the SIAC courts through judicial review into the Court of Appeal and then appealed once again to the Supreme Court. And what we have seen is a seismic difference in approach between the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, where the Court of Appeal were very much on the side of Shamima Begum's arguments, and the Supreme Court, in rather interesting terms, were not on that. So I think there's still everything to play for. But certainly this very much bolsters the case that how can a 15-year-old girl be held culpable to a degree, blaming her for joining ISIS when it was Western governments, and we have yet to see whether our government was involved in this. I accept that the British police, the Met Police, claim that they had no knowledge about this before it happened, but we've heard nothing from MI5 and MI6. There's been not a peep from them. And I find it very difficult to swallow that Canada, which is part of the Five Eyes security network, was running an operation affecting British children and British citizens in the 20s, in the numbers, without either the UK security service knowing about it or having a hand in it. Because on one hand, if they didn't know about it, well, then the UK security services are utterly incompetent. And B, if they did have a hand in it, well, then they're culpable.
There's an article. I mean, you mentioned the involvement of the British services, Daily Sabah. I think they're definitely alleging this as well, that there was definitely British involvement alongside the Canadian involvement. But yeah, I think.
I mean, that's part of the complaint that the Times have had, is that there's been a cover-up, and that cover-up isn't just on the UK government side. There's been deathly silence by the UK media as well over the last 7 years. And you're absolutely right. Sabah has reported that Mr. Al-Rashid, the Canadian asset, he was sending information over to the Canadian embassy in Jordan, allegedly to an individual called Matt, and it's the Turkish authorities, the police themselves in Turkey, who believe that Matt was a UK security service operative. So, that's been published. Now, the issue is, well, why hasn't the UK papers and the UK media seized upon that and started asking questions? Well, do we have a UK agent who was handling a Canadian agent who was then trafficking children? Because the person trafficking is culpable, but the person handling the trafficker, the spy master themselves, well, certainly they're more culpable.
So if we don't see this put to rest and the people that were involved brought to justice and a severe overhaul of the way secret services and everything, how they transpire, we know they seem to be above the law anyway. How can that be a danger? Because a lot of people are of the opinion, it's just brown people. It's just the Muslims. It's just terrorism. But we know that that's where it starts from. That's where certain legislation, certain precedents get set. What could that mean for the rest of the British population eventually?
Well, as I say, I mentioned Prince Andrew. I mentioned Ghislaine Maxwell. I mentioned Jeffrey Epstein. And it appears that their victims were not brown. Their victims were white young girls. And the idea that over the decades that they were all operating, that the security services, remember in any sort of royal involvement where you have a member of the royal family, they have a security detail around them, a police detail around them all the time. So the idea that the authorities or those charged with protecting us were not aware of what was going on is laughable. So yes, it's true that in this case, Shamima Begum being a brown person, there's a certain media bias against them, a certain governmental bias against them, a certain indigenous population right-wing attitude against them. But they've been losing their children to child sexual exploitation with the authorities turning a blind eye for decades, maybe longer. I mean, even with Jimmy Savile, he was at the heart of the BBC. He was made an OBE. He was a friend of the Queen, a friend of Margaret Thatcher, a friend of Prince Charles. He had keys to hospitals where he was abusing children in them. No suggestion that they were brown. They were mostly white girls. And this had happened for decades. So it's shocking that the general public don't make the connection between these abusers and the fact that a blind eye is being turned to the abuse of children of all complexions in this country by the authorities. So this book alleges, and so does the Times newspaper, that there's been a cover-up by the UK authorities for a number of years over this issue of Shamima Begum and the involvement of a Western security service. Now, we've been asking for many years of Tower Hamlets Council under John Biggs for what's known as a serious case review, a review into what failures took place in that school, Bethnal Green Academy, and the police and what have you, around how 4 London schoolgirls managed to get to Syria. And there's a precedent for this. The Brighton Council did the same thing when 2 young boys managed to go over to Syria themselves. But John Biggs has blocked our request for the last 7 years. Luckily for us, I guess, John Biggs is no longer mayor of Tower Hamlets Council. We have Lutfur Rahman, and it appears with these revelations as to why there was a cover-up by Tower Hamlets Council. We're hoping that Lutfur Rahman doesn't engage in the same sort of kids' love process. We're hoping, and we've asked, that he actually initiate a serious case review as to these girls' disappearances now, even though it's so many years later. There's still lessons to be learned here.
A lot of food for thought there. And as you guys saw, the evidence is what on the screen. Definitely do your own reading and, look into this as well. Tasnime Akunjee, Jazakallah khair for joining us.
Always a pleasure.